Hello everyone, and welcome back to the next episode in our little series where we are making a top-down game in Unity. Last time we got our camera set up so that we can follow the character around as he moves around the island, but boy, this is a boring island to walk around at the moment. We need to do something about that. We need to get the buildings in and the trees and the fences and everything else so that we can make this a little bit prettier to look at. And the first thing we need to do then is we need to actually bring in our assets that we're able to work with so that we can start putting in bits and pieces that we want. For that then, go to wherever it is that you've got your assets stored. If you're using the Maple Tales pack, then we're going to be going into buildings first, and we'll get all four of these. We'll have the cabin, the igloo, and their separate doors as well. Drag and drop those straight into our assets in our game. They will load over for us. And while we're here, we might as well go back a bit, and we're also going to go into the decorations folder as well. And we're going to bring over every single one of these because we're going to need to work with a lot of them. So we can just highlight all of them, drag and drop them in as well. From here then, we can see all of the new sprites that we've brought over to our assets. And what we need to do is we need to highlight all of the newer ones. So if we hit Shift and then click on the first one and on the last one, that should highlight everybody. Then if you hold down Control, you can go through and deselect the ones that we don't want to make any changes to. So obviously the input system, because that's not even a sprite. Also our walking and our idle animations, and any of the sprites and tile sheets or anything like that that you've already worked with. Although, don't worry if you've left one or two accidentally highlighted, it's not going to make any changes because we're just making them all the same at this point anyway. Because what we need to do is we need to go to the import setting of all of these, exactly the same as we did for our idle and walking sprites, and we need to change them over to the mode that we're working with. So each of these is a single sprite, so we need to change our sprite mode to single. We're working with 16, not 100 pixels per unit. Our pivot center can stay in the center for now. We're going to have to change that on most of these in a little bit. We can come down to our filter mode, change that to point, and come to our compression and change that to none so that we are sticking with maximum quality. Then we can just hit apply to all of these. Now they will be ready for us to use in our scene. From here then, what we want to do is we want to work through each of these in order of how important they are as we're setting up our scene. So obviously the cabin and the igloo are going to be the most important ones as they are destinations for our player. So we'll start off with our cabin and we're just going to drag and drop that into the scene. You'll likely find that it just sits like there's nothing there, and that's because at this point Unity doesn't know what you want to do with this asset, and so it's trying to render it behind our tile map. You will find that it'll render in if you place it just off the tile map, or if you hover over something that's already in the map, it kind of gives Unity a hint as to what you want it to do. Then it will come in and then you'll be able to just work with it quite easily. If for whatever reason you don't already have anything on your tile map, I just get rid of that. You can also drag and drop things into the hierarchy, and then that will make them appear pretty much in the center of your scene, and you'll be able to move them from there. From here though, I'm just going to bring this little cabin over, and for now I'm going to pop it there, and we'll play our game and see how our player is interacting with it. So good to see that it is rendering properly, it is showing all of its pixels at the right size, and it is the right size. And if I walk my character over to it, well, I appear to have become a ghost. And that is because at this point, Unity doesn't know how we want this scene to be rendering. At this point, under its default settings, Unity is effectively viewing the game like it is a cake. So if this was our lowest layer, there's our sea, then we've got our snow layer on top of that, and then here's our bits of dirt as well. Well, it thinks the camera is here, so it's looking down on these and saying, yep, that one's on top of here, and then, oh, they've just added in a little image that's a player, and here's the cabin, and here are going to be some trees, and here's some rocks, and here's some fences, and this is clearly not what we want it to do. As far as it's concerned, the world is flat. We want this to change a little bit. We want Unity to still see our layers, so it's still going to put our sea at the back, our snow, and then our dirt. But anything which is on the same layer, we want it to act like the camera is actually looking at it from an angle at this point. And instead of saying, oh, our players and our cabins are all on the same level, anything that is further away from the camera should be rendered behind that which is closer. So if this is our player and this is our cabin, the player should be seen first and it should be in front of our cabin. And also, bearing in mind the fact that the player is where the camera is, so our camera is going to be down here. If you imagine this is a person, not some weird box. Here is our scene. Here's all of our layers behind there, so there's the player. Here's our cabin. Here's a tree, sort of, in front of it. This is why we call it YSort, it's because this is our x-axis and this is our y-axis. And so that's what we're changing. We're telling the camera to sort which way around these are all going to get rendered based on where they are sitting on the y-axis. Hence why we call it YSort. Oh, that's some terrible writing. Luckily for us though, all that explaining is easily done with a few quick button presses. All we need to do is come up to Edit in Unity, come down to our project settings. This will open up the global settings for our game as they currently stand. Come over to Graphics, and then from Graphics come down to our camera settings. We don't want this to be on default. We want to give this a custom axis, and we want to tell it to obey Y. So change Y to 1, and if Z is on 1, just change that over to 0. Now, when we come out of that, don't open this, but when we come out of that and we close down our project settings, we will be able to play our game. Now, Unity should know it should be rendering those things which are closest first. So we can now walk in front of the cabin. And if we go right the way behind it, we will be able to go around it. You'll notice though that, well, I change about here. I can get about halfway up that cabin before I suddenly zip to being behind it. That needs to change too. And the reason why Unity is doing that is because of something called its pivot point. So Unity doesn't know that this is a 3D object, it just sees an image. If we come and have a look at this cabin though in our sprite editor, you can see it's got a little round circle in the middle of it. And as far as Unity is concerned, in terms of trying to decide the YSort for this, for deciding what is in front of and what is behind, this little pivot point is the important one. And we don't want it to be here in the middle of this building, it makes absolutely no sense. We need to drag this then down to the base of the sprite. It needs to go at the point where the player stands in front. So the player, walking along in front of this building, should always be in front of this sprite. It should never be behind, it's going to look like you've chopped your player in half. But as soon as the player goes beyond this point, so for example if they were walking alongside this building, as soon as they get to here, they're officially behind where this little post is. They shouldn't be standing in front of it, they'll look like they're climbing up the building otherwise. And so 99.99% of times you'll need to put the pivot point just at the base of your sprite. We also need to tell Unity though, over in our sprite renderer, that we want it to obey where we've put the pivot point, not its own central point. So make sure that where it says sort point, you've got pivot ticked rather than center. Then we just need to hit apply up at the top to apply our changes, and if we come over to our game and we play it, we should now find that our player is able to walk in front of our cabin. It looks like we're not sort of chopped in half, and we can also walk alongside it and we're standing by our building without looking like we're climbing it, and we can also, well, swim at this point but go right the way behind the roof as well, and it makes sense. One thing you will notice is that if I get my player a little bit too close, oh, there we go, he appears to have been chopped in half by the building. And that is because if we just come out of the game and we have a look at our player and we have a look at the sprite editor, oh look, more pivot points. Every single one of the sprites in the animation has got a pivot point as well, and they all need to be set to the base of the player. And there's two ways we can go about this. You can come down, if you have a look at our sprite information sheet just at the bottom, we can see at the moment the pivot is set to be in the center. You can click this to be down in the bottom, either in the center or the right. One thing you will notice though is that because we've got a shadow underneath where this player is, that doesn't actually quite work for us. We need it to be a little bit up from there, just so that it's in between his little feet. So that's the point where he's going to change between what he's in front of and behind. If we have a look then at our custom pivot point down the bottom, we can see it's roughly 0.5 by 0.06. Let's just try setting that to 0.5 to make it a nice rounded number. And we'll set this to 0.05 and we'll see how that looks as well. Well, that looks pretty good. That is pretty much between his feet. What we need to do then is we need to go along each of these, change our pivot from center to being custom, and have it be 0.5 by 0.05. And the reason why we need to change these over for every single one of these sprites is because we want to make sure that that pivot point is in exactly the same point on our custom location. Otherwise, you can end up with the problem with having sprites where some of them are in front, some of them are behind, and then it'll make it look really glitchy. It's quite unpleasant to play. But we'll just change all these over. Then we can come back to our game and have a little look and see how we're looking now if we're still being chopped in half. We should find something a little bit strange is going on. So if I stand here, whoop, 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 whoop. You remember what I said before about how changing the pivots and they're wrong will make your player look really weird? So at this point, the reason why this is happening is because we've changed the pivot point on the idles. We have not changed it on the walk. So we can see that we're sort of glitching up and down a little bit. So that needs to be changed as well. Come out of our game. We will just come back down to our assets. Here are all of our walking assets. We can have a look at them in the sprite editor. And oh look, there's our little pivot point. We better change that one over too. Then, once we've changed all of our custom pivots to be 0.5 and 0.05, same as they were before, if we then hit apply, we can come back to our scene, and just the same as with our cabin, we had to remind Unity in the sprite renderer that it now needs to use the sprite sort point of pivot, same for the player. Highlight the player, we can see in the sprite renderer, we're currently going by the center. No, we want to go by those pivots that we have very carefully set for you. Now when we hit play them, we should find that we are behaving nicely. Nothing is glitching weirdly, and we can just walk nicely in front of our building and behind it and then back in front of it, and everything is just working for us. Brilliant. And then from here, it's now a case of just patiently and methodically going through every single one of these sprites, bringing them into the scene, having a look at them in the editor, adjust the pivot point down to the base of the sprite, making sure you're not including the shadow in that, just to the base of the sprite itself. Then come over to its sort point, change that to obey the pivot that we have set, hit apply, and have a look at the scene, and then you can just check that it's working by wiggling it backwards and forwards over your player to make sure it is behind, it's in front, it's behind, it's in front. And go through every single one of the assets that the player will need to be able to walk around. So all of the trees, the bits of grasses and that sort of thing. You can ignore the doors because those will just sit on the fronts of the buildings, and you can also ignore bits like the snow decorations that the player is always going to walk over. But effectively, if you want the player to be able to walk behind it, you're going to have to set its pivot point. Even little tufts of grass. Just go through them one at a time and change them all over. And hopefully once you've done that, you should have something that looks vaguely like this, sort of artist's palette of all of our different assets that we've got to work with. And if we click on each of them, we can see that they've all had their pivot points set down to the base, with our sprite sort point going from the pivot, so they are all able to be stood in front of and behind by our player. But you may have noticed when you came to the igloo that we actually have a little bit of an issue. If I set the pivot point on the igloo down to the base where it has been on everything else that's worked just fine, then when we're playing the game we wander down to the igloo, well that's not right, is it? I should be standing in front of it here, but I also need to be standing in front of it here and here as well, because this is a bit of an oddly shaped building. I need that pivot point to not be at the front. Because this is the point where the character needs to be able to go behind this particular image, we need the pivot point to be in line with just here where this building curves. So if we just bring this pivot point up so that this is now in line with where that curve is going, and it's roughly about there, maybe move it up just a smidgy little bit more, what we will find now is that our player should be able to walk right the way around this building, and then it's not going to go behind this image until we get past that point, because that's where we've set the pivot to be. So we'll just apply that, and then we will go back to our game and we will play this one again, and we will now see how we're reacting to it. As I say, in 99% of cases, setting the pivot to just be at the front of something is usually absolutely fine to have a character be able to walk around it. Just in some oddly shaped things, you might need to change it a bit. There we go though. I can stand right up against this igloo and I'm not behind it until I go around that corner. Much better. Obviously at the moment we're able to walk right up over the building, but we're going to change that next. Before we do that though, let's just do a little bit of tidying up. I'm sure you noticed that as we were dragging and dropping things in from our assets folder into our scene, they were populating down the hierarchy on the left-hand side. What happened then is each time you dragged in one of these items, such as this tree for example, Unity saw that you've pulled in an image, so it created a game object with the same name, Bear Tree in this instance, and that game object is going to have a sprite renderer attached to it in order to show the image that you've just dragged in. So if you click on Adjust in the Assets folder, you'll notice that the inspector just says, this is a picture, what do you want me to do with it? Whereas when you click on Bear Tree over in the hierarchy, it says, okay, it's a picture, we've got that, but we've now got a location as well because we're actually in the game. And so we can just tidy away all of these sprites now so that they're not cluttering up our Assets folder. To do that, we can right-click in the folder, create a new folder. Inside there, here it is, and we're just going to call it Sprites. Once that's created, we can then highlight all of the different sprites, including the walking animations and all of that. Basically, if it's a picture, you can just highlight that, drag it and drop it into that folder just to tidy everything up so that it's not sort of cluttering around and we might accidentally pick it up for some reason. There we go, all our sprites tidied off. And with things a little bit more tidied away now, we can look at setting it up so that our player is able to walk through some objects but not through others, which usually is pretty self-explanatory. I can't walk through a cabin, but I can walk through grass. In order to do that then, we need to set up some colliders. So if we just have a little look at our player, we can see that we've got a rigid body attached. That's what's allowing us to move around, that's what's giving us physics, but we don't have a collider, which is what we would use to prevent us from walking through stuff. So if we go to Add Component and we just type in Collider, in fact if we just write in col, it'll bring them all up, we can see there is a wide selection of different shapes of colliders for us to choose from. Our little guy is a fairly square little guy, so we're going to give him a box collider 2D. Be sure in 2D games not to try to give it a 3D collider, that's just going to really confuse things. Stick with the 2D ones. In this instance then, as I say, we're just going to give it a box collider. If we then zoom in on our little guy so that we can see him, and we have a look at our box collider down there, we can see we can edit it. So if we click on these little three dots, we can bring that up. It's very faint, but it is a green box going around the edge of the character. That is too big. This is deciding where we are able to effectively start a collision. So if there's another collider just here and we walked into it, it would start from this box. That is absolutely massive. We only really want it to cover our player's feet and then up to roughly the width of his body. I'm not going to make him too wide. Very wide colliders tend to be very annoying for players because you just bash into stuff all the time. We're going to make it about the same size as his little feet down at the bottom, and then that's going to decide the width of our player and where we're going to start knocking into things. For now though, we'll just save that as it is. Make sure on your box collider side you do not hit his trigger. That would let you walk through stuff. So if you find yourself able to walk through colliders, check on that. Next though, so our player now has a collider, let's add one onto the cabin. So again, we can highlight that from our hierarchy. We can come over to our components, and exactly the same, we're just going to add on another box collider. Exactly the same again, we're going to edit it using those three little dots. That'll bring us up the boundary so that we can see it. Again, it is too big. We want the player to be able to walk right up to the walls and not be blocked off by those, so we can bring these edges in a little bit. And we also want the player to be able to walk around the back of the building as well. So if we just bring down the top, we can see the player's going to be able to walk up to there, bash into it, and then walk around the back of this as well. So let's just have a quick little play of that and just see how that's working. Now with our player, when we walk them towards the cabin, boop, we just sort of bop into the side of it, and we're not able to do that sort of strange phasing and ghosting through that we were doing before. We can walk around the back. Whoa, what on earth is going on? Oh, I think he might be getting a little bit dizzy. Let's just stop that for a second. What's going on there then is that effectively when you bashed into a corner, he started to spin because he's got physics applied to him. So what we'll do is we'll go back over to our player, go over to our rigid body, have a look at our constraints, and we want to freeze rotation. We don't want him to be able to spin around like that. That looks very unnerving indeed. Right, so now when we play again, if we knock into corners, we shouldn't start doing any weird spinning. We can Go right up against every corner and just make absolutely certain, nope, we're definitely not going to start spinning around. Good, that has frozen our rotation in place. From here then, now that we've got the collider on the player set up and we know that that's working, we need to add them to everything else that the player can't walk through, which is going to mean going through each and every single one of our assets that we've got that has a solidarity to it, adding a component, adding a little box collider, and then making sure that box collider just covers over the very base of each of these assets, because we want to be able to walk right the way around. We just want to be able to make sure we're blocking us from walking through. In fact, the only ones we're not going to be adding colliders to in this instance is going to be the fences. We'll do those in a moment. For now, just go through each of the trees and the snowmen and just add colliders to the base of them so that everybody is set up to not be able to be passed through. Once you've gone through all of those, when you come to the igloo, look, that awkward shape is coming back to bite us once again, because in this instance, a box collider isn't going to work. We want the player to be able to walk right the way around this curve, not have to stop in a sort of jagged straight line. And so for this one, we don't want to use the box collider at all. Instead, we want to use the polygon collider, because this is going to allow us to create a shape. So we add the polygon collider on. Then when we click on edit, you can see it's gone and made a sort of rough shape going around it. What we can do though is we can zoom in on this and we can move individual points so that we're able to follow very carefully the shape that this actual igloo is creating. So we're going to follow it right the way around and make a nice curved shape going around so that the player can walk around without actually being able to walk over the building. When it comes to going around the corners, just the same as before, make sure that there is space for the player to be able to pass around the back, but follow roughly where that curve would be, you reckon, behind that building, just so that it kind of physically makes sense. Don't worry about getting the shape absolutely exact. With this game being a little bit zoomed out anyway, it doesn't really matter, just so long as we are pretty much following where those curves would be. And you can, of course, keep playing a game in order just to test it, to make sure that you're not having any strange glitching or strange interactions with these things. Make certain that the player is interacting with them the way that you want to. We can walk behind the building, and then we can walk right the way around it, following this curve nicely. Sweet. And now that we've done all of this work with these assets, the last thing we want to do is have to do it all over again every single time we want to make just a few more trees in order to create a forest. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn all of these into prefabs. So what we can do, come down to your assets folder, right click in here, and we're going to create another folder in there. And this time we're just going to call it prefab. Into this folder then, what you can do is we can take each of our items, so starting off with our cabin, we're going to take it from the hierarchy, drag it and drop it into our prefab folder. Quick. As soon as you do so, it'll appear in there and you'll notice that it has turned blue up here in our hierarchy. We can do that as well with our tree, for example. We'll just drag and drop that one in. We can see that one's also turned blue. What will happen now then is when we come to our prefab folder and say, okay, I want a little stand of trees over here, we can just drag and drop straight from the prefabs. In they all go. Let's make a nice little forest of trees, and every single one of them already has its collider attached to it, already has its pivot point set, already knows to render its pivot and its sprite from that pivot point rather than going from the center. Effectively, they're all going to be nice little copies of each other rather than having to constantly redo this. So anything that you're going to be making multiples of, always make prefabs of them. So to make life a little bit easier, we will just highlight all the rest of these ones using our shift key, then we can just drag and drop them straight into our prefab folder. Whoop, and there they all are. They've all populated nicely. And the next thing we need to work on then is going to be our fences. Remember we left out giving these any colliders attached to them, and that is because you certainly can attach a collider onto a fence, for example. We can just come along, box collider exactly the same as we did before, and then we can create a little collider right down just at the base of it. Come back here you, and then we'll say, okay, that's where our collision is going to be for that fence. The only issue is, when this is in the prefab and we're replicating them side by side, unless you get this exact and lined up, then you can find that the player keeps bashing into it. For that reason, I don't usually do that. To remove a component from something, what you can do is have it highlighted, and then if you right-click on it, just on its title, it'll come up and say remove component, and then we can just take it straight off, so that's no longer attached to this fence. Instead, what we can do then is we can create a little fenced area just using our prefabs. With our fence post that goes to the side, you can come over to the sprite renderer and then we can flip it on its x-axis, pop, and then that will make it face the other direction, so we've got both a left and right fence panel. And once the fence has been completed, what we can then do is the same as before when we created the map boundary, is we can create a separate boundary collider in this world that's not actually attached to this fence. And we'll just have one big one for each side of our fence rather than lots and lots and lots and lots of little individual ones getting repeated. To do that then, what we'll do is we'll come over to our hierarchy. If you find you're running out of space like this and it's starting to get a little bit challenging, one thing you can do is you can click to highlight all of the elements within your scene. For example, all of these prefabs that we've got here, with them highlighted, right click, then go down to create an empty parent, and click on that, and then it will put them all into an empty game object for us, which we can just call environment. Then with that created, once we've done that, we can close that down just to hide all of those bits and pieces. They're all still in there. They're all still part of our world, exactly the same as they should be. It's just a little bit tidier. So to create our boundaries for our fences, we're going to need 2 more game objects created in our hierarchy. So we'll have 2 empty objects, one called cabin fence left and one called cabin fence right. And to each of these, we can attach a collider. Colliders don't have to be on something specific. They can just be their own object within a game. So what we'll do with this game object, we'll just come over to our component and we'll attach onto this another polygon collider. We can then click on the 3 little dots to edit that, and it's brought us up what looks like a pentagon, I believe that is. My knowledge of shapes isn't fantastic, but we're working on the left-hand fence, so what we need to do is we just need to copy this shape over using this collider. So we can come over, we can drag all of these points out, and then make the shape of our fence. Remembering that the fence is a 3D object in sort of the real world, so don't just have a single line, make sure it has got a little bit of body to it. If you need to add in more points, for example, this isn't going to have enough for me, when I drag that one down, I can place that one there, but I'm going to need to have another, and you can see Unity is creating a little dot there in the middle of that line, and when I click on it, it'll just make a new point so that I can drag that one up. We can roughly line this one in there so that we've got a nice solid fence that our character can't walk through. And then we just repeat the process again for the right-hand fence. This time, of course, attached to the cabin fence right object. So again, add on our polygon collider, say that we want to edit it, and then we'll just make it match up with the shape. This way then, so long as this collider is poking into this building, I know that its own collider is sort of following around the edge there, there'll be no gaps big enough that our player character is going to be able to squeeze through and be able to get into places we don't want them to be able to go to without going through the rather more sensible gate entrance. So we can see that our character, yep, we can walk right the way up to the fence, but we can't walk through it. We're stuck on this side of it. Nice. And also using this same technique then, we can create yet another empty object, and this time it's going to be the island boundary. So we'll have an island boundary, to which we're then going to add on another one of our colliders, but this time we're going to go for one that's slightly different, and we're going to use the edge collider. And the reason why we're using that, rather than the box collider or the polygon collider in order to outline our island, is that we don't want to exclude the player. We don't want them to be forced outside of this box. We want them to be forced inside of it, for which the edge is much more useful. That will literally just give us this tiny little line here when we go up to edit it. And we need to take this line and we're going to use it to go right the way around the entire island now. Now when we press play, We should find that our player is effectively locked into the island, and now can't go wandering off and go out to sea. We also can't walk through any of our buildings, or our trees, or our fences, or anything like that. So at this point, the island is pretty much set up and ready for us to start doing the decorating. Yay! So, with the island all set up and with the assets all prepared, remembering that anytime you're bringing anything new in, just make sure you're taking it out of the prefab folder so that you're using the assets that you've already done all the tinkering with, so that they're just going to behave the way that you want them to. You are now ready to just take your time and enjoy decorating up the island, making it look however you want to, remembering as well, of course, that you can still go into the tile palettes if you want to change your snow layer, your sea layer, or any of your dirt, or anything like that, so that it makes more sense if you're changing house locations or whatever. You can go and do that as well. I'm going to have a bit of fun just playing around with this island and getting exactly how I want it to be. You can watch the time-lapse of that or go away and work on your own. I'm sure you've been listening to my voice for long enough at this point. Anywho though, I will see you again in the next one. Happy game making everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye!